Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're joined now by the vice chairman of IBM, Gary Cohn, who also served as former President Trump's top economic advisor in the White House. Good to have you back here. It's expected to be a very big week with the Federal Reserve expected to cut interest rates because inflation does appear to be moderating. How big of a cut do you expect, and what will this mean for prices, particularly for housing, which is such a big part of inflation?
So, Margaret, let me take one quick step back. The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. They have a dual mandate of stable prices, which means they fight inflation, and they have a second mandate, which is full employment. For the last 4 years, they've been fighting the stable prices mandate. They've had to bring inflation down. We got inflation as high as 9.1%. We've seen the Fed raise interest rates from 0 to 5+%. That has effectively dropped inflation back to 2.5%. We're now to the point where the other side of the dual mandate is kicking in. We're now starting to see unemployment tick up. We're now over 4% unemployment. So the Fed is going to start cutting interest rates. We all believe about 25 basis points this week, and maybe about 100 basis points or 1% between now and the end of the year. What the Federal Reserve has control over is they have control over the very short-term overnight interest rate. They don't control longer dated maturities or longer dated yields. When people take out a mortgage, they're borrowing money sometimes for up to 30 years. Those rates are not affected by what the Federal Reserve does. Unfortunately, I think that those rates have already priced in what the Federal Reserve is going to do. So I do not see a major impact to the mortgage market or credit card financing or anything else by the Fed starting to drop rates this week.
That's interesting because we saw that the Federal Reserve of New York cited the highest credit card delinquency rate in over a decade. Around 9.1% of credit card balances turned delinquent over the past year. That suggests consumers are under pressure.
Yeah, consumers are under enormous pressure. So remember, we all came out of COVID with the consumers in the best balance sheets we had seen in our lifetimes. We put enormous amount of stimulus into consumers' balance sheets. When the economy reopened, consumers did what we really know how to do well in the United States, is not only spend what they have in their account, they use all the capacity on their credit cards. People went out and spent, they took vacations, we saw that, they spent a lot of money on their houses, and they went out and got their credit cards fully charged up. They assumed that the economy was going to stay strong. They assumed that job growth was going to stay steady. They assumed that they would continue to be able to maintain that lifestyle. We're starting to see softness in the economy, softness in the job market. We're seeing it's harder and harder to get a job. And so we're starting to see it in delinquencies in credit cards. That's exactly where we would start to see the softness in the economy. And people are going to continue to have trouble getting a job that pays more than the last job. We just got done with a cycle, and we see this in economic data. We just got done with a cycle where a lot of people were quitting their job. People only quit their job when they believe they can get a job at a higher price point.
Well, this is going to be the economy the next president inherits. You just heard J.D. Vance, the senator, say here that Donald Trump wants to end all taxes on overtime. No income tax, no payroll tax, wants to end the tax on tips and Social Security. That's going to add somewhere between $4 and $6 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. Does this math add up to you?
So, Margaret, look, I think every elected politician would like to say no one has to pay taxes on anything. And I think every American citizen would like not to pay taxes.
Why not?
I mean, why not? That would be a perfect utopian world where we didn't have to pay taxes. I don't think there's a reality in that. Remember, at the end of the day, the government has a budgetary process. It's a very intricate budgetary process where we take in revenue. The biggest revenue creator we have in the government is taxes, taxation on individuals, taxation on corporations. They take in that revenue and then they spend it. They spend it for the goods and services that we as citizens expect them to provide for us. Today, the biggest single expense that we have in the federal government at $3 billion a day is interest on the debt. The second biggest expense we have is our military. Our military costs us $2 billion a day. Then you start working your way down into all the social services and products that every citizen of this country wants. If we're not paying taxes into the system, how do we pay for the interest on debt? How do we defend our country? How do we give out the social services that citizens of this country expect the federal government to be delivering to them?
And that's why I asked the senator whether fiscally conservative Republicans would ever vote for what the Trump ticket is proposing here. And the response was that the government would take in money from tariffs. And Senator Vance said that's not just on foreign-made goods, but goods made by companies who produce overseas. That seems to open up punishments for American companies, too. What is he signaling here? What do you think this means?
I am not 100% what he means, but let's take a step back and look at tariffs, because I think we all talk about tariffs, and I think we need to understand tariffs. First of all, I think tariffs is an important instrument for any president to have. It's a very influential instrument that they have when they're dealing with any foreign government. The way tariffs are used effectively, and I support this, is when a country is producing a product substantially below where we can produce it in this country because they have a competitive advantage. So in China, they do not pay for capital. Most of the companies are government or state-owned entities, so therefore their cost of capital is zero. They do not pay living wages to their employees, so therefore their cost of labor is substantially lower than us. They don't have environmental controls, so they can pollute all they want. So their ability to produce a product is substantially different than that in the United States.
Right.
China produces an electric vehicle, let's call it at $20,000 a car. We produce pretty decent electric vehicles. Ford and GM produce them in the $30,000 a car range. It seems completely reasonable for me if the US government wants to tariff, and they should tariff, the Chinese electric vehicle up to a price equal to, and I would say even higher than the US vehicle. Because
the Biden administration is doing that.
We want to protect those jobs in America. We should not allow them to use their unfair advantage to disadvantage American workers. On the flip side, we import many products that we do not produce in this country.
Right.
Those products are in high demand, and we need them. A lot of them are pharmaceuticals, many other products that we expect to have on our shelves when we go in the store. If we start tariffing those products, we will have inflation. To the extent that we want to produce those products in this country, we should start out on a very methodical path to do that. And I think we just saw the way that can be done pretty reasonably. The CHIPS Act, which was passed a year ago, was a piece of government legislation that says we will give chips manufacturers money to build foundries in the United States so we can build chips here. And then we can become self-sufficient on chip manufacturing. Then you know what we can do? Then we can tariff foreign chips from flooding our market at a discount price. But until we have the capacity to build them ourselves, putting a tariff on those chips would just be debilitating to our economy.
Right. It's more complicated, in other words, than what we're hearing on the campaign trail. Taxes are going to go up, as you've talked about on this program before, December 31st, 2025. The new president and the Congress are going to have to come to an agreement on this. You were the architect of those tax cuts that Donald Trump says he wants to extend. How do you expect Congress and the White House to work out where we're going to end up?
So taxes on the personal side change on December 31st, 2025.
Individual tax rate.
The individual tax rate. The corporate tax rate is permanent.
Although both campaigns want to change it.
Yeah, well, look, whenever you start down the path of doing tax legislation, everything's on the table.
Yeah.
You know, so I would assume that they will look at both corporate and individual tax rates. Taxes are very complicated. But as you've pointed out, to change the tax law, it's a legislative process in this country. You need the House and the Senate and the White House to agree. I think the composition of the House and the Senate are going to be very important to what final tax legislation looks like. And I do think there is growing opposition in both the House and the Senate, and I would say on both sides of the aisle, for a large deficit tax plan.
All these plans being proposed by the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign come with tremendous price tags. What I think you just said is that Congress would not agree to sign off on any of them. Is that right?
Yes. What I'm saying is the tax plans as proposed right now spend a lot of money, don't bring in that much money.
Right.
So therefore, the net effect of that is we increase the United States deficit. I don't think there is a lot of appetite in the Congress to do that. We have grown our deficit quite substantially over the last 4 or 5 years. Some of that because of the pandemic, and that's when the government should be building a deficit. They should be building a deficit when there's a pandemic, because that is their central role, is to maintain the stability of the country. In better times, when we've got substantial economic growth, we should be trying to pay down that deficit to put ourselves in a better position. We're now in one of those better times, or at least not a bad time. And so I don't believe that Congress has a large appetite to pass a tax plan on either side that has a huge deficit component to it.
Gary Cohn, more to talk about with you, but we got to leave it there for today. Good to have you back. We'll be right back. For more on the upcoming election and the efforts underway to secure the vote, we turn to David Becker. He's a former civil rights attorney at the Department of Justice, who now leads the Center of Election Innovation and Research. He's also a CBS contributor on election law. And Chris Krebs, the former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, now an expert and analyst here at CBS. Good to have you both. David, let me start with you. We saw this letter this past week from secretaries of state in all 50 states and District of Columbia issuing concern that we could see voters disenfranchised because of this increase in mail returned as undeliverable at higher than usual rates, even in cases where a voter is known not to have moved. And Donald Trump was tweeting about this morning. You can't trust the Postal Service. How much of a problem is this going to be for mail-in voting?
Well, it's a potential problem. I'm hearing this from state officials and local officials, of course, they're in the states. And we are seeing mail voting spread as an option around the country. I think we're likely to see less mail voting than we did in 2020 because hopefully we won't have a pandemic to deal with in 2024. But it's a significant problem. And it really stresses the importance of voters to make a plan when they're voting. Almost every voter in the United States has an option to vote early in person, 97% of all of them in every state except for Mississippi, Alabama, New Hampshire. 36 states and DC do offer mail voting without an excuse. But if you're going to vote by mail, get your ballot early, request it early, make sure you get it, and then return it early. If you're going to return it by the mail, that's fine. Just do it very early. There's also options for drop boxes and dropping it off at election offices and vote centers. That's going to be incredibly important for voters to self-educate about those options, just in case there are problems with the Postal Service.
And it's this coming week, right, where it's voter registration, voter awareness.
Yeah.
What is it?
So this coming week on Tuesday is National Voter Registration Day. There's still plenty of time to register. As we sit here today, there's 3 weeks left in every state. Some states go much longer than that, but no matter where you are, if you're an eligible voter, you can go to vote.gov. That's a great place to start. Taylor Swift mentioned it earlier this week. And it's a great place to start and get registered. Every eligible voter in the United States can still check their registration and get registered for at least 3 weeks.
Put it on your to-do list. Chris, I want to talk about some of the information environment issues that we are in. It is not every Face the Nation that we begin talking about rumors of cats and dogs and geese in Ohio. The reason we're doing it is because the Republican nominee on the debate stage repeated something that started as a Facebook rumor that got amplified that the senator from Ohio says resulted in calls to his office. You've watched this kind of echo chamber and ecosystem of information. What do you make of a moment like this and how frequently things like this get replicated now? Like, how does someone at home navigate truth when I went through fact check after fact check, the police chief, the mayor, the governor, and again and again and again, I was told, nope, you're wrong.
Yeah. I mean, the fact of the matter is social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever, it's not the real world. It's not reality. And so it provides an environment where specious claims like this can catch fire, but they tend to be constrained to that platform. What we saw on Tuesday was the firewall between mainstream and reality in this extremely online ecosystem break down, and they crossed over. And keep in mind that these social media platforms, well, Facebook has 1 billion plus users on a monthly basis. X has much, much fewer. And so what happened Tuesday night was the vast majority of people, there were 57 million, I think, viewers of the debate, the vast majority of them had never heard about this cats and dogs being barbecued in Springfield, Ohio. And I expected it because, unfortunately, David and I have to live in this world to anticipate what's coming. And so I had seen it going through social media for a couple days, and I fully expected it to jump, into the conversation, go mainstream, and boom, there it is. So to your question, or to your point, how does one kind of, introduce some kind of personal resilience here? And it's exactly doing what you do. Go to mainstream outlets and trusted outlets and do a little bit of fact checking verification. And listen to the public officials, listen to
Right.
Governor DeWine, listen to the mayor and the city manager. Who's to know better than someone that's actually willing to put their face in their name to a claim rather than someone randomly on a social media platform?
And this will become increasingly relevant as we get to voting and
Yes.
going to voting facilities. Not Facebook rumors, the elected officials, the people who hold office. That's who we as journalists cite.
Yes.
And that's who people at home should look to.
Well, and to David's point about vote.gov and having a voting plan, yes, that is absolutely critical. But when you do come across rumors online of registration dates changing or voting locations or precincts closing, there are ways that you as an individual voter can go confirm, and that tends to go to the local election official or the Secretary of State. Trusted Info 2024, that's the campaign that the National Association of Secretaries of State and the National Association of State Election Directors have mounted now for 3 election cycles in a row. It's go to the authoritative source in your jurisdiction, which tends to be your Secretary of State, your state election director, or your local election officials.
David, in the last election, we saw some of those local officials stand up in a way that it took a lot of guts to stand up to federal pressure. You saw that in the state of Georgia. You saw that in the state of Arizona. You speak to election officials in states around this country right now. Where are you seeing that strength, and are there areas of concern?
So I'm seeing tremendous strength from the election officials, despite the fact that they've been under pressure, stress, abuse, and harassment for 4 years now, that their work has continually withstood every bit of scrutiny that's been applied. And the fact that since 2020, every election they've run has been run very well and similarly withstood that scrutiny. But they're still exhausted. This disinformation environment Chris is talking about, that has real world impacts on our neighbors, on our fellow citizens who are working every day to give us all our voice. They are answering questions that have no bearing to reality all the time about importing voters, about problems with the voting process, and they're having to navigate those while they're also still having to plan for an election that is likely going to be very high turnout, probably similar to 2020, perhaps even higher. People are very interested in this election, but they're ready. But one of the best things we can do is support them, is to support them by, as Chris suggests, listening to the actual information, going to the official sources for real information, getting information and making a plan in advance about how you're going to vote. And then finally, one of the things I always encourage, if you have any doubts or questions, volunteer to be a poll worker. You will learn so much about the process. You will find out how the process and why the process is so secure, how many redundancies and checks and balances and pieces of transparency are in place in that process. That will really help your election officials out, because then you become an evangelist for our very effective election system out in the community.
So, Chris, we are seeing more foreign efforts to meddle in this election. We expect in the coming days federal officials to file charges related to that Iranian hack and dump campaign that seems to have been foiled thus far, but attempt to hurt the Trump campaign. How much more of this is coming?
Well, my sense, and based on prior experience, particularly in 2020, where we saw the Iranians try to meddle in that election, the Russians, the Chinese, going back to 2016 with the Russians, is that they tend not to just have a single effort or work stream. There's an overarching strategy, a multifaceted, multi-pronged campaign that they've pulled together. We certainly know this with the Russians, that there are various work streams that they have launched against the U.S. The Iranians very likely have the same. So perhaps this is just the tip of the iceberg, and I've said that before. Not all of these activities, these work streams, will be successful or will break through, but the hack and leak campaign specific to Iran. But the main point in what I'm observing out of the United States government is that they are looking to keep constant pressure, consistent engagement against the Russians, against the Iranians, against the Chinese throughout the course of this election and afterwards. Remember, we have to run through the tape here, and that tape is inauguration.
Yep. And David, quickly, it is illegal for a non-citizen to vote in a federal election. In some localities, they can vote in municipal elections. Donald Trump is talking about this as a real concern.
Yeah, and it's not a real concern. And even Republican states that have looked into this have found incredibly small numbers of even potential non-citizens registered. We have found virtually zero non-citizens actually voting. Georgia did a full audit of its list and found 0 non-citizens voting. That's because the protections in place are very effective. It's illegal to vote as a non-citizen. ID is required to register to vote. And if you're a non-citizen and you register and you vote, you will go to jail and you will be deported. So it's very important how effective those deterrence mechanisms are. This is not a problem. You'll hear that from Republican and Democratic election officials across the country.
Gentlemen, thank you both.
Thank you, Margaret.
We'll be talking a lot in the coming months. We'll be right back. More than 1,000 people have been charged in the January 6th attack on the Capitol in what has become the largest prosecution in history. For tonight's season premiere of 60 Minutes, Scott Pelley spoke with the lead prosecutor in charge. Here's a preview.
Democracy stopped for about 6 hours. The vote was counted at 3:44 a.m. With 2 weeks until Inauguration Day, it was the Trump Justice Department that set the standards for the prosecutions. Decisions were made by career prosecutors who work at justice for years, regardless of who the president might be.
The career prosecutors quickly realized that you needed guidelines in place, determinations about who was going to be charged, who wasn't going to be charged, and what they would be charged with. That process started in January 7th, 2021, during the prior administration. To this day, we continue to use guidelines that the career prosecutors put in place during the prior administration.
And how do they guide you?
What we're generally focusing on of the thousands of people who you could potentially charge that day are people who actually entered into the Capitol, people who engaged in violent or destructive behavior, people who illegally carried firearms or other weapons on Capitol grounds, and people who helped others to get into the Capitol building.
You're not charging everyone who was there that day.
That is correct. We have turned down hundreds of cases where the FBI is saying there is evidence here, it's your determination, prosecutors, whether you think this should be prosecuted.
And why would you turn them down?
Because they don't fit within the guidelines that the career prosecutors have been using, or we don't think that there's sufficient evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt.
You can watch the full story and the season premiere of 60 Minutes tonight, right after football. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.